What's happening, YouTube? It's Simon 466 Cards, and today I'm going to talk about the monthly GemRate data that comes out and why I think people might be misunderstanding what that data represents. So on the screen, you can see it's Jeff Wilson from Sports Card Investor doing his Cards on the Table show, and he's about to do a segment on the monthly GemRate numbers from January. And I know it's a cottage industry to make fun of Jeff, to poke at Jeff. I don't really have any issues with Jeff. In fact, I think he seems like a nice guy, to be totally honest. But in this case, I think he's very wrong with what he's about to say. And I'm going to show that to you with data and numbers. But first off, I'm going to play this clip for you. So let's just jump right into it. If Jeff sounds a little bit hyper, it's because I'm playing at 1.25 speed. So here we go.
And all I heard last year was people saying, oh, it's the junk slab era, and slabs aren't really worth much anymore, and there's so many slabs that are only worth $1. They're now coasters. Grading is going to slow down because people are starting to realize this. Grading can't possibly continue the way that it was, and yet it's sitting here today, and it's still breaking records.
All right. So first of all, Jeff, thank you for shouting out the coasters idea. That was a Simon special, so thank you for shouting that out. Now, having said that, we're going to go in reverse order. First of all, we're going to talk about the dollar slabs thing. I can just go to eBay. I can look at all the graded sales, completed sales. You can see here, I clicked completed sales. Take my word for it. I selected anything under $1. Oh, here it is. Here it says right here. And you can see in the last 3 months on eBay with the BGS, PSA, or SJC slab, there have been 8,400 graded cards sold. So that equates to, if you multiply that by 4, roughly 35,000 slabs selling for $1 or less in a year. So it's not nothing. There's definitely those that exist. Now, that's the first piece. That's the simple piece that you can just look into right away with data, and you can kind of, it's not a myth. There are dollar slabs being sold all the time. The other piece is this idea that because the GemRate reports say that PSA, you can see it's almost like clockwork. Every month, 1.22 in January, 1.23 million in December, 1.13 in November, 1.2 in October, 1.2 in September, 1.23 in August, and then you get to July, and that's the national, and it's the summer, so people aren't taking holidays. But like in the last 6-7 months, it's right around 1.2 million. And so he's saying, well, that number's not changing, and as a result, that shows that demand hasn't changed. But I don't agree. In fact, I think he's very wrong. And I think it's because people misunderstand what these monthly numbers actually represent, because they don't have the full picture. And I'm going to tell you, the PSA number doesn't tell you anything useful about demand, whereas the SGC number does. And so I'm going to do that in this video. I'm going to explain how to actually use these GemRate numbers, because I think a lot of people are misusing them and assuming that the numbers that you see represent demand, when sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. So let's jump right into it. So let's forget about grading. I'm going to think about grading like a bucket of water. And that is going to be my metaphor or comparison to reflect capacity, because that's one thing the GemRate report doesn't show. So think about grading like a bucket of water. It's a bucket that holds 1.2 liters. Obviously, the graded numbers of PSA are 1.2 million. I'm using that intentionally to help make this more clear. So this bucket can hold 1.2 liters of water. So you can pour up to 1.2 liters of water into it, and it'll hold 1.2 liters. However, if you have a big old jug of water and it can hold 5 liters, and you try and pour it into this bucket of water, guess how much water that bucket can hold? It's still 1.2 liters. It doesn't matter how many liters of water you have. You could pour 8 liters of water into there. It could still only hold 1.2, because that's the maximum room or the max capacity. And that's the point part of the point I'm trying to make here, is that capacity matters. Maximum capacity matters. The second piece that matters is the size of the backlog, because although the end bucket here holds 1.2 liters at a time, there might be other things waiting to go into the bucket that you don't know about. And that's definitely true for grading, right? We don't know how big the backlog is at PSA, although I'm about to calculate it for you. And that actually matters. And why does it matter? Because if you're only pouring in 1 liter, but the backlog still has plenty of water left, then you're still going to have 1.2 liters in the bucket, because the backlog will be more than enough to be more than enough to fill the bucket of water. And so you don't actually know how much new water is being added in, because the backlog will cover enough to make the 1.2 liter bucket whole. And so that is a very important piece of information that is not reflected at all in the GemRate numbers. We don't know how big the backlog is, and we don't know what the maximum capacity is, although we can make a guess that it's 1.2 million. And so that's the true way to understand whether demand is increasing or decreasing. It's not looking at the monthly GemRate numbers when you're at maximum capacity like PSA is. What you have to do is look at the size of the backlog, which we don't know the size of. And more importantly, we don't know whether or not the backlog is increasing or decreasing, unless you're a crazy person like me. So I made this video, I'm going to say December of 2022. I can't believe how bad my thumbnails used to be. This is horrific looking back on it, but here we are. I will link to this video in the description below, because it does have some good information. In this video, I basically estimated and calculated the amount of cards in the backlog every month from when PSA shut down on March 30th, 2021, all the way through to the middle or end of 2022. Sorry, the shutdown was March of 2021, and then I calculated all the way through to August of 2022. So at its peak, when the first shut down, PSA had a backlog of about 13 million cards. When we go till August of 2022, the backlog was still over 2 million cards. I won't get into how to calculate these numbers. I will link to that in the description below. Just trust me on that one, okay? And so the backlog now sits at less than 1 month's worth of full capacity. I know that PSA sent out an email and had an announcement about how their bulk and value or TCG bulk, now the turnaround time is estimated to be 45 business days. It's 30% faster than before, and there's no additional cost. But you're only going to guarantee 45 business days when you know you can do better than that, right? Like, I think PSA's learned from the pandemic bubble not to under-promise or over-promise and then under-deliver. They know better, right? So even though they say 45 business days, that's not actually the case. And that's when I turn to Neo Cards and Comics, who has a great channel, which I enjoy quite a bit. He sent his cards in for the January monthly special. He sent his cards in according to this video, and I'll link to that in the description below. The January monthly special, he shipped his cards January the 2nd. They arrived at PSA January the 5th. They were checked in at PSA on January the 8th, and he received the cards on February the 1st. Already in his hands back home. So if it takes roughly the same time to ship from him to PSA, and you assume that PSA to him is roughly the same time, that means that PSA shipped them probably January the 29th, which means it only took 21 days to process. Checked in January the 8th, checked out or mailed out January the 29th, that's 21 days, right? And so 21 days is 0.7 months. And so if you do the math here, because we assume the capacity is 1.2 million, because it's 1.2 million, 1.2 million, 1.2 million, 1.2 million, 1.2 million, basically every single month for the last 6 months, we can then calculate that the actual backlog at PSA is 800,000 at most, but I think it's likely less than that. I won't get into the reasons why. It might be a little bit closer to like 600. And so here's what I think is actually happening at PSA and what I think will happen in the future. Capacity is 1.2 million. I don't think there's any argument as to why capacity is not roughly 1.2 million. The problem is that the monthly demand cannot support it, right? Because a while back, in 2022, the backlog was roughly two plus million. We're now at less than a million, right? So it's getting chipped away because of that gap. The capacity is 1.2 and monthly demand is slightly less than that. Whether it's 1.1, 1.15, 1.05, 1.0, who knows, right? But that gap is going to chip away at the existing pipeline and backlog. And so that means that turnaround times will keep improving unless something fundamentally changes. And what does that mean? That means that eventually the backlog will essentially be zero. And at that point, there's going to be two options for PSA. First option is decrease prices. Second option is reduce max capacity. Now, I'm not going to predict exactly what they're going to do, but option one leads to less revenue. Option two leads to less costs. Think of which ones of those two make the most amount of sense if you are Nat Turner and or a rational businessman. Probably going to go with option two. I guess I did predict what would happen, right? And so even though the monthly numbers still say 1.2 million every single month at PSA, the backlog calculation I've made here suggests that there actually isn't enough demand to keep up with capacity. And that's why I don't think Jeff is right. Even though the number is still 1.2 million, at some point that little bit of backlog is going to run out, probably within 6 to 8 months. And then I'm interested to see what will happen. However, that's not to say, oh, one more thing. The monthly PSA specials. They have, this is the February one, I believe. There's one for TCG, and then there's one, I think, for baseball, right? And you don't run specials or gimmicks like this if you have enough demand to fill in your pipeline. You only do this to induce extra demand to get people to send in their cards to you. If everything, what they weren't doing? They weren't running these specials in 2020, right? 2024, things are a little bit different, right? And this is part of the measures that they're taking to fill in that gap between demand and their max capacity. So that's enough for PSA. SGC, however, is the exact opposite of PSA because they're actually building up their backlog and pipeline. I forget where I heard this, but I believe it was from Mike Geo from the SCN podcast. He said that, everybody's heard that SGC turnaround times were amazing and they've been amazing for all through 2023. But he said in January that it actually slowed down. It actually took a little bit longer. And if you look at the GemRate numbers, this is how and why and when the GemRate numbers can tell you more about demand. You could see here, if we again look at SGC, in August, 118,000, September, 115, 129, 121, December, 123, and then January, 157. So what this tells me is SGC's maximum capacity, the size of their bucket, remember that metaphor, is roughly 150 to 160,000 cards, give or take a few thousand here or there. And their demand in January was more than that. And that's why it took an extra amount of time. There was an actual bit of a delay to get the cards back to people's hands. And so for SGC, it seems that their demand is exceeding their capacity, unlike PSA. Having said that, obviously the scope of the numbers or the magnitude of the numbers is completely different. We're talking about 150,000-ish for SGC as their capacity. PSA, it's 1.2 million, right? But so in the big picture, they're not that comparable. But for the purposes of what Jeff's saying, that's why I believe he's wrong about PSA specifically. So would love to hear your thoughts and comments about my analysis on grading capacity and pipeline and backlogs and how and when and why to use the GemRate numbers and how not to use them, as I've shown you in the video. Would love to know your thoughts and comments about this video. It's ironic that I made this video because operations during my MBA was probably one of the classes I hated the most, and now here I am making a full-blown 15-minute video about it. So, maybe the joke's on me on this one. And finally, before I get to the next point here, shout out to Ryan from GemRate for his amazing data. None of the stuff I've said is anything bad about him or his data. It's just making people understand how to use the data. Because data misused is worse than no data at all. Something that I very much believe in. Sometimes on this channel, if I am actually prepared, I preview the next video, and we're going to stay on the topic of grading. Next time around, I'm going to talk about why I think the big four of sports card grading is about to become the big three. So take your guesses now as to which of these four you think I'm going to talk about. But thank you, as always, for listening and watching. I'll talk to you all soon. Cheers.